Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. We hope you had a happy Easter. Uh, Today we'll be talking about the Great Depression in Texas. Um, my view of the Great Depression in Texas and the book's view varies a little bit. And so when you get back to the book, you're welcome to read it. But I'm going to go with my version since I did a lot of oral histories on the Great Depression when I was a little bit younger. But before we can do that, we have to do our questions. So, first off, I want to know what was the name of the Mexican leader who led raids into the United States and into, I think it was um, in Texas too. And then uh, what is the person called who takes care of the ravens at the Tower of London? And that was CNN 10, April the 13th. So the Great Depression, exactly what happened. Okay, so after World War One, the country experienced a time of economic growth known as the Roaring Twenties, and so people had some disposable income. They were buying more stuff than they had before. Corporations were making a lot of money. People were putting their money into the stock market. Your book says, well, Texans didn't have money, so they didn't put money into the stock market, which is not entirely true. Okay. Morals were loosened as women dressed in shorter dresses. The dresses were above the knee, and they were called flappers, and everyone seemed to be drinking illegal alcohol because of prohibition. During this time, President Harding was president, and he had a huge scandal during his presidency. Harding was not a good moral character. He had affairs with different women, and his late night poker games at the White House were well known. But he had a huge scandal called the Teapot Dome scandal, where his Secretary of the Environment sold leases to land that was supposed to be protected under the government. And he died in office. His vice president took over as president. That was President Calvin Coolidge, who was also known as Silent Cal. And Silent Cal had this idea that, hey, he didn't need to do anything. He uh, he had a hands-off approach in government. Two interesting stories about Silent Cal. And he's called Silent Cal because he usually answered questions with yes or no. He didn't expound at all. Um, in the White House, he would take a nap every day about 3 o'clock. And one thing he loved to do in the White House was ring the bell for a servant, a butler to come find him to see what he wanted, and then he'd go and hide. So that's just two little stories about Silent Cal. Next election, President Hoover was elected. I have a book on my shelf called How to Feed the World, which was written by Herbert Hoover. But in October 29th, 1929, the stock market crashed. So it's true that many Texans lost their money in the stock market crash. Okay, so yes, there were Texans that had money in the stock market, and they did lose all their money because of the depression. Many banks closed, and as a result of that, people who had money in the bank lost all their money. So that affected a lot of Texans. The main reason the depression affected a lot of Texans, many Texans had bought land or refinanced their land, and they lost their farms. Some of those family farms had been in their family for generations. And one thing about the Depression, there was no jobs to be found. So many Texans found themselves doing things like picking cotton or begging on the side of the road, like you see here in the picture. And many Texans were living in their cars. So it wasn't uncommon to walk down a Texas street and see somebody actually living in their car. Some Texans had to live off the land, so they were eating things like possum and armadillos. And because President Hoover refused to try to correct the economy, the armadillo became known as the Hoover hog. So out of this grew a pair of Texas outlaws named Bonnie and Clyde. So um, the book talks about them a little bit, and so I thought I'd talk about them a little bit also. Um, they, uh, Clyde Barrow had been somebody that had been in and out of prison. He picked up a young 19-year-old named Bonnie Parker, and they started robbing. Now, they were known for robbing banks, but what they usually robbed were filling stations and small stores. And although they came from Texas, they went all over the central United States, Kansas, Nebraska, all those areas. And finally, they were killed in Louisiana. And um, I guess they got a lot of attention because Bonnie Parker was a woman. You see here a picture that was in all the newspapers where she's smoking a cigar. Um, they always carried guns around. But to a lot of poor people, they were heroes because they were robbing the banks. Because a lot of poor people thought the banks had robbed them by losing all their money or by taking away their farm. So I hope you have a good day. Don't forget to answer my questions at cbaldwin, SACBSTX.org. Thanks.